The Fortress of Humaitá, known metaphorically as the Gibraltar of South America, was a military installation near the mouth of the River Paraguay, a strategic site without equal in the region. It was the key to Paraguay and the upper rivers. It played a crucial role in the bloodiest conflict in the continent's history, the Paraguayan War. The site was a meander, a sharp horseshoe bend in the river. Practically all vessels wishing to enter the Republic of Paraguay were forced to navigate it. The bend was commanded by a 6,000-foot line of artillery batteries, at the end of which was a chain boom which, when raised, closed the river to navigation. The fortress was protected from attack on its landward side by impassable swamp or extensive earthworks which, at the greatest extension, stretched for 8 lineal miles, had a garrison of 18,000 men and deployed 120 cannon. At its zenith, Humaitá was reputed to be impassable to enemy shipping. The widespread perception which it created in its heyday, that Paraguay was practically immune to naval attack, may have induced its Marshal President Francisco Solano Lopez to take unnecessary risks in foreign policy and, in particular, to seize government vessels and provinces of the much more populous Brazil and Argentina and to send armies to invade them and Uruguay. They united against him in the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. The war led to his country's utter defeat and ruin, and the casualties were immense. A declared purpose of the Treaty of the Triple Alliance was the demolition of the Humaitá fortifications and that none others of that sort should be built again. However, the fortress, though not by then invulnerable to the latest armor-plated warships, was a serious obstacle to the Allies' plans to proceed upriver to the Paraguayan capital Asunción and to recapture the Brazilian territory of Mato Grosso. It delayed them for 2.5 years. It was taken in the Siege of Humaitá, then razed pursuant to the treaty. For present-day Paraguayans, Humaitá is a symbol of national pride, standing for the country's unyielding will to resist. Motives for its construction. Key to Paraguay. Paraguay is a landlocked country, and for much of its history it was difficult of access, except by sailing from the Atlantic up the River Paraná and hence the River Paraguay, as the early Spanish explorers had done. There were other means of ingress, but they would have required an invading force to be resupplied through difficult and hostile country. So the command of the river was key to the security of Paraguay, who feared and distrusted its two much larger neighbors Brazil and Argentina. Anxiety about the Brazilian Empire. In a long history of conflicts between the empires of Portugal and Spain in America, the Portuguese made numerous incursions, some of them permanent, into Spanish-claimed territory. Slave raids by bandeirantes from what is now Brazil into the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay carried off many Guarani inhabitants, who feared and despised the Brazilians. The boundaries between the two empires were not resolved and the conflicts continued after independence. When Portuguese America became the Empire of Brazil, Brazil had no practical access to its own territory of Mato Grosso except by sailing from the Atlantic Ocean up the River Paraguay. Fear that Paraguay might interfere with the navigation was a source of conflict. Where Paraguay ended, and where the Mato Grosso began, was a matter of opinion. Anxiety about Buenos Aires. The Spanish viceroyalty of the River Plate occupied an enormous territory roughly coterminous with the modern-day territories of Bolivia, central and northern Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. Although it did not exist for very long, the Spanish viceroy had his seat in the city of Buenos Aires. Upon becoming independent from Spain, the city claimed and thought itself rightly to be the capital of an identical territory it called the United Provinces of South America. Other provinces, especially Bolivia, Uruguay and Paraguay, begged to differ, and the viceroyalty broke up in acrimony and warfare. In particular, Buenos Aires did not recognize the independence of Paraguay and in 1811 sent an army under General Belgrano to try to recover it. The Buenos Aires governor Juan Manuel Rosas during his dictatorship tried to bring Paraguay to heel by closing the River Paraná to commercial traffic. Buenos Aires province fell out with the other provinces of the Argentine Confederation and declared itself the independent state of Buenos Aires. It did not recognize Paraguay's independence even after the others had. It was not until quite late in the 19th century that a reunited Argentina formally recognized an independent Paraguay. Even so, the boundaries between Argentina and Paraguay were in dispute, notably the Chaco and Misiones territories. Defensive outlook of Paraguay. Upon its independence in 1811, Paraguay tried to keep out of the anarchy of adjoining Hispanic America. Its formidable dictator José Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia imposed a strict policy of isolation. During his reign, few were allowed to enter Paraguay or to leave it. Professor Williams' assessment. In an attempt to coerce Paraguay economically and bring it to its knees, Buenos Aires only stiffened Paraguayan nationalism and produced a voluntary xenophobic isolation of the breakaway province. After Francia's death, he was succeeded by Carlos Antonio López, the father of Francisco Solano López. López eyed to open up Paraguay to foreign trade and technology, but the steamship made his country vulnerable to invasion and he understandably feared the machinations of his powerful neighbors. During his presidency there were conflicts, not only with Brazil and Buenos Aires, but also the United States. The Uswater Witch Affair of 1855, in which the fort of Itapiru fired upon an American warship, which led to a U.S. naval expedition against Paraguay in 1858. Although Carlos López was astute enough to know when to back down, he resolved to make Paraguay immune to foreign attack in future. A major cause of its construction, initial works in 1777. In colonial times, a modest guardia was established at Humaitá, a place about 15 miles above the mouth of the River Paraguay. However, a more formidable version was built in stages on the orders of López I. He started the work hurriedly in 1854 during conflict with Brazil over boundaries and navigation, when Paraguay was threatened by a Brazilian flotilla. Fortunately for López, the Brazilians were delayed by the low state of the river. The Paraguayan author and diplomat Gregorio Binix, who was in the Paraguayan army at the time, gives a slightly different account. López I, hearing the Brazilian squadron was on its way, immediately transferred 6,000 troops from Paso de Patria to Humaitá, working night and day. In 15 days they fortified that place, including furnaces for making red-hot cannonballs. The Brazilian squadron desisted because of the strength of the fortifications. The low state of the water is mentioned only incidentally. To a design by the Hungarian Colonel of Engineers Wisner de Morgenstern, he hastily fortified the river's left bank with a few batteries, which were continually but slowly augmented, and a trench was dug on the land side enclosing the rear of them. He felled the virgin forest, leaving only a few scattered trees, grubbed up the roots, and laid out the first batteries, to whose completion some 2 years were devoted. By January 1859 the installation appeared formidable, as described by an eyewitness aboard US Fulton, part of the Paraguay expedition sent by President Buchanan to demand reparations for wrongs alleged to have been done to the United States. 16 ominous apertures pointed the gloom, and whatever else they may contain, upon us, and, like the eyes of the figure in the picture, seem to follow the vessel's motion. These apertures are those of the casemate battery, constructed of brick but very deep, and defended by the very formidable battery of 16 8-inch guns. Numerous other batteries were noticed. Fulton, having left the rest of her squadron behind, was allowed to proceed upriver. The works, which were continually extended, were supervised by British engineers, of whom there were a considerable number on contract to the government of Paraguay. Description of the finished fortress. Location: the Fortress of Humaitá was situated on a level cliff about 30 feet above the river, on a sharp horseshoe bend. The bend, called the Vuelta de Humaitá, was an ideal strategic pinch point. It was some 1,500 meters long, the navigable channel narrowed to only 200 meters broad, the current was 2.8 knots and in places 3 knots. Difficult for the ships of the day to stem, and ideal for the release of torpedoes. An unpleasant surprise for an invading flotilla was that, owing to the peculiar conformation of the riverbed, there were treacherous backwaters which often neutralized the action of the rudder, in direct proportion to the length of vessels. First impression. The explorer Captain Sir Richard Burton, who visited the scene during the war, when the Brazilians were still dismantling the fortifications, described it thus: "The sweep is more than usually concave, to the benefit of gunnery and the detriment of shipping. Nothing more dangerous than this great bend, where vessels were almost sure to get confused under fire, as happened at Port Hudson to the fleet commanded by Admiral D.G. Farragut. The level bank, 20 to 30 feet above the river, and dipping in places, is bounded by swamps upstream and downstream. Earthworks, consisting of trenches, curtains and redans, disposed at intervals where wanted, and suggesting the lines of Torres Vedras, rest both their extremities upon the river, whose shape here is that of the letter U, and extend in gibbous shape inland to the south. The outline measures nearly 8 miles and a half, and encloses meadowland to the extent of 8 million square yards, a glorious battlefield. River batteries. An invading force, if steaming around the bend upriver, would have to pass 8 batteries, all capable of concentrating fire on the re-entrant angle. Furthermore, shipping was within range of the heavy guns well before arriving at the bend, and well after it. Preliminary batteries. First, it had to pass the Humaitá redoubt, armed with a single 8-inch gun. It must then pass the Itapirus, the Pesada, all partly revetted with brick, the Octavia Madam Lynch, the Coimbra, and the Tacuari. The Bateria Londres next. The invading flotilla must pass the Bateria Londres. Its walls were 8.2 meters thick. It was supposed to be rendered bomb-proof by layers of earth heaped upon brick arches, and there were embrasures for 16 guns. Of these ports, said Burton, 8 were walled up and converted into workshops, because the artillerymen were in hourly dread of the caving in and crumbling down. The Bateria Cadenas. As a climax, the invading force would come alongside the Bateria Cadenas, backed by the artillery barracks. According to a survey by the Brazilian Engineering Corps, this battery had 18 guns. The chain boom. The boom across the river, intended to detain shipping under the guns, is variously described in the sources. Richard Burton and Commander Kennedy Arendt said it comprised 7 chains twisted together, of which the largest had a 1.75-inch diameter link. It was made fast to a windlass supported by a house about 100 yards from the bank. Nearer the battery stood still larger capstan. Other sources, notably George Thompson, wrote that there were 3 chains side by side, of which the heaviest had 7.5-inch links, sustained by barges and canoes. The official staff report of Allied force that captured Humaitá, dated the 29th of July 1868, by Cordero Torres y Alvim, said that on both banks of the river there were 7 chains which, after entering the water, were bound to 3. The latter were partly sustained by large floating iron boxes. Approach before even arriving at the Vuelta de Humaitá. An invading squadron would first have to navigate the River Paraguay from its mouth, and run the gauntlet of such batteries as the Paraguayans were able to deploy on its left bank, particularly at Curaçao and Curupati. Whether unarmored warships could have done so without being sunk was never ascertained. During the war, the unarmored wooden vessels of the Brazilian Navy did not attempt it, although heavily iron-plated ships ought not be sunk by these river batteries. The very weight and size made them difficult, and at times impossible, to navigate in the shallow waters of the River Paraguay. As Commander Kennedy of the Royal Navy observed, the River Paraguay presents no important obstacles to navigation, the principal point to observe being the rise of the water. This varies sometimes as much as 3 fathoms. The danger attendant on grounding in the Paraguay has a sharp rocky bottom. The entrance to the Paraguay at Tres Bocas is 500 yards wide, and at medium river there is a depth of 12 feet of water. The ironclads of the Brazilian fleet, many of which drew 12 and 13 feet of water, were entirely dependent on these periodical rises, both for forward movements and also for retreat, if it should have been necessary. Their guns and ammunition were not shipped until they arrived at Corrientes, for the Parana is equally shallow in various parts. It is difficult to conceive a more formidable obstacle to an advancing squadron than this small portion of the river between Tres Bocas and Humaitá. The water is shallow, and most uncertain in its depth. The turnings in the channel are sharp and frequent, and every available point was bristling with guns of heavy caliber. Torpedoes. For an invading force of ironclads, the most dangerous aspect of Humaitá was not the artillery batteries but the torpedoes that could be released in the confined, shallow and uncharted stream of the River Paraguay. These torpedoes were improvised floating contact mines. The first was devised by a Yankee, Mr. Kruger. They consisted of a zinc cylinder containing a charge of gunpowder. The largest used a charge of 1,500 pounds, and the explosion shook the ground at the town of Corrientes, Argentina, 40 miles off. The fuses were designed and made by George Frederick Masterman, chief apothecary to the Paraguayan army. They were glass capsules of sulfuric acid which, when broken by striking a heavy object, ignited a potassium chlorate sugar mixture. Although most of these devices failed to go off, except prematurely, one did sink the 1,000-ton Brazilian ironclad Rio de Janeiro, killing 155 men, and since they were released almost every night, they had to be taken seriously. The Brazilian Navy had patrol boats out rowing in 3 shifts, including nights, which tried to spot the floating torpedoes. If they did, they attempted to hook their floats with grappling irons on long lines. Wrote Commander Kennedy RN, it was a service of great danger. Deploying the torpedoes was not without its dangers either. After Kruger's death, he was blown up by one of his torpedoes. The work was taken over by a Paraguayan called Ramos, who had served an apprenticeship in England. He met the same fate, and the work was given to a Polish refugee named Michkowski. Michkowski used to take the torpedoes down the river in a canoe rowed by 4 boys. One day he was distracted and the boys absconded to the Allies with the torpedo. He was arrested, reduced to the ranks and sent to the front, where he was soon killed. An anonymous, if brave, Paraguayan diver tried to attach a torpedo to the Brazilian ironclad Brazil by hand. This was deduced when he was found entangled in her rudder chains, drowned. The Paraguayans deliberately moored empty demijohns in the river to make the Brazilian Navy suppose they marked the situations of torpedoes. It made them noticeably reluctant to navigate its waters. Landward defenses. The Quadrilateral. The Paraguayans had also taken precautions against Humaitá being seized from the landward side. Much of it was protected naturally by carrizal, marshy swamp, and where not, an elaborate system of trenches was constructed, eventually extending over 13 kilometers with palisades and chevaux de frise at regular intervals, known as the Quadrilateral. These trenches mounted batteries where appropriate. The trenches and natural barriers are shown in the map reproduced in this section of this article, which was drawn to scale by Lt. Colonel George Thompson of the Paraguayan Army. He personally made a detailed trigonometric survey of the ground. The map is corroborated by Burton's detailed verbal description based on his own inspection on horseback and on figures supplied to him by Lt. Colonel Chodashevich of the Argentine Army. Burton reported that the layout required a garrison of at least 10,000 men. At the time of the siege of Humaitá, the Allied commander-in-chief estimated that it had 18,000 and possibly 20,000 men and 120 cannon, not including the river batteries. Unmapped terrain. While the Paraguayans were familiar with the ground, maps of the territory were, for the Allies, non-existent. The area lay in the province of Nimbaku, which is flat, low-lying and obscured by swamp carrizal. For example, when they established the main camp at 2UT in southern Paraguay, the Allies did not realize they were placing it within earshot of the southeastern line of the Quadrilateral, the Source Trench. In his 5-volume work on the Paraguayan War, the Brazilian historian Tasso Fragasso insists that a Brazilian High Command letter of April 1867 does not leave the slightest doubt that the Allies were completely ignorant not only of the topography of the terrain, but that all of it was protected by lines of entrenchments. In order to gradually map the area, the Allies were obliged to resort to mangrullos, or captive observation balloons, but the Paraguayans obscured the terrain by lighting fires of damp grass. Headquarters. Lopez II established his headquarters at Paso Pucu, one of the corners of the Quadrilateral. Amongst orange groves stood the dwellings of Lopez, his mistress Eliza Lynch, and military officers who enjoyed his confidence, e.g. Generals Barrios Resquin and Bruges, also Bishop Palacios, Lt. Colonel George Thompson the chief engineer, and Dr. Stewart the surgeon general. The houses were simple ranchos with thatched roofs. A quadrangle of large traverses or earthworks protected from Allied artillery fire his house, that of Mrs. Lynch, and those of his servants. These earthworks were made of sods, and the largest was said to contain 422,080 pieces. At the center of the quadrangle was a Groleau Watchtower. According to Burton, the Groleau's ladders were surrounded by hides and matting, an unusual precaution intended to conceal petticoated ankles, for it was used by Mrs. Lynch, and indeed a contemporaneous drawing by the Brazilian Engineering Corps does show, unusually for Paraguay, a Groleau with a covered ascent. A large military hospital was established halfway between Humaitá and Paso Pucu, and another one for field officers at Paso Pucu itself. At Paso Pucu there were 2 settlements for female camp followers. They assisted in the hospitals and washed the soldiers' clothes. They were allowed no rations, and lived on what beef the soldiers gave them. There was a cemetery, and a prisoner of war compound. Newspapers at headquarters were published, the military newspapers Cabichui and Cacique-Lambaré. These featured crude but effective propaganda woodcuts, often of a racially offensive nature. Paper was in short supply, but an ersatz version was improvised from Caraguatá. Electrical telegraphy. In the final stages of the fortifications, electrical telegraph lines were laid out from Humaitá and the points in the Quadrilateral to Lopez's headquarters at Paso Pucu, and he could instantly be informed, in Morse code, of an enemy attack on any point. The English military engineer George Thompson, a colonel in the Paraguayan army, recorded that the Guarani became adept telegraphists. The Chaco side on the opposite bank of the River Paraguay begins the area known as the Gran Chaco, with a different, hot, semi-arid climate. The opposite bank, now part of Argentina, but in dispute in those days, was inhabited by none except the fierce Toba Amerindians. In front of Humaitá the land was quite impracticable as far as timber, which, when the river was high, was completely underwater. Strategic significance and perception. At least before the introduction of iron-plated warships, Humaitá had the reputation of being impregnable, and it became famous as the Sebastopol of South America. During the war, the European press compared it to the Richmond and Vicksburg of the American Civil War. It was also famed in Europe and the United States as the Gibraltar of South America. Michael Mulhall, editor of the Buenos Aires Standard, passed the site in 1863 and reported it to the world in these terms: a succession of formidable batteries which frowned on us as we passed under the range. NY vessel, unless iron-plated, attempting to force a passage must be sunk by the raking and concentrated fire of this fortification, which is a key to Paraguay and the upper rivers. When Lopez I built Humaitá, all warships were made of wood, and steamships were mostly paddle-driven. Wooden paddle steamers, if intending to proceed into Paraguay, would have had to steam against the current, past the succession of batteries where the range was 200 meters or less, and somehow cut through the boom of twisted chains, without being sunk. This appeared to be impossible. A modern appreciation by Professor Wigan. As a strategic site, Humaitá was without equal in the region, for enemy ships could not ascend the Paraguay without passing under its guns. It was also exceptionally well protected on the south and east by marshes and lagoons. The few dry areas leading to it could be reinforced with troops in such a way as to frustrate any attack.